Welcome back to Book View Now, our coverage of the Los Angeles Times Festival of the Book. I'm Jeffrey Brown, and we're coming into the mid-afternoon hour, but still going quite strong here for another hour and a half or so. I'm joined now by two authors. Tom Bissell is the author of Apostle, Travels Among the Tombs of the 12, and Susan Jacoby, Strange Gods, A Secular History of Conversion. So what's your starting point? What were you after?
I decided after writing a doomed novel about one of the apostles, John, I spent 5 years writing that I was so interested in the idea of apostolic remains being places that people still go to today.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And that there are these places all over the world, and sometimes very surprising places, that a very interesting travel book could be written by going to these places and hanging out at them, seeing who goes there, talking to custodians who own them, and then trying to tell the very complicated story of early Christianity and the growth of Christian belief through these 12 places.
Was there a sense that these apostles who are so known in one way are not really known? Is it?
Most Christians who are not as familiar with their Bibles as they should be assume that there's tons of information about the apostles in the New Testament. In fact, there's very little. And one of the great mysteries of early Christianity is that Jesus' 12 chosen followers left apparently so little a mark on the origins of the faith. And so these places oftentimes come about because some ambitious bishop in the 6th or 7th or 8th century discovered the bones of Thomas here or Matthew here. And so I think most of these churches began as a way to entice, for lack of a better term, tourists to come and visit these churches. It was a surefire way to ensure that your church was a commonly visited place, which was to have a lot of relics. And so I think most of these places begin as a sort of half-credulous fantasy, and that gradually grows into these edifices of really imposing, seemingly official historical discoveries. Yeah. And in my view, the only possible apostolic reliquary that has the faintest chance of actually being based on something real is probably Peter's, which they can date the remains of an ancient red wall that they found underneath the Vatican, rediscovered in the 40s. They're pretty certain, the best they can say is that people in the 2nd century thought this is Peter was buried. And so that's pretty old, and that's roughly 100 years after Peter would have been buried there. So I think the only one that has a cat's chance in hell of being actual is Peter's. The rest, I think,
So your approach is travel and research.
Yes.
Yeah. What did you find? I mean, you were talking about how in studying the apostles and going back to see their history, you're learning something about the early church, right? Were there surprises for you, something that
I think
you hadn't expected?
The biggest revolution in New Testament studies in the last 100 years, definitely the last 50 years, has been the extent to which scholars have stopped viewing Paul as divorced from the Jewishness of the 1st century. I think most serious scholars have moved completely away from the fact that there was such a thing as Gentile Christianity right away after Jesus' sojourn on this earth. And the prolongedness and the difficulty of the break from Jewish Christianity to Gentile Christianity, which is in the New Testament, sort of between the lines, when you read the text closely, you can see it. And the early church evangelists did their best to paper over some of that trauma. But the extent to which that break was difficult and resisted and prolonged, and how much it really messed up subsequent history. I mean, so many of our problems, even today, stem from things that happened in the 1st century. That is kind of mind-boggling to think about.
I just want to ask you about writing on subjects like this, which are so,
deeply
strong in people, right? You're really going to their gut sometimes when you talk about religion. What is that? How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? How do you approach it?
So I thought I wrote a very sympathetic account of these things, and I don't really have any overt hostility to religion except in its most sort of virulent fundamentalist form. Then I begin to have problems. But I tried to write a very sympathetic book, and then discovered that most Christians have just not read it that way, and even when you try to sort of extend the hand of empathy from a non-believer's perspective, I think it's very hard for sincerely strongly believing Christians to sort of take that hand and sort of go to the same place that you've gone to.